Right in. So we're going to be talking about how to prioritize the most impactful strategy services for your website redesign. My name is Kelsey Boyd. I'm a senior strategist at Aten and have been working at Aten for the past couple of years and in user research and strategy for the past 8 years or so. So really excited to talk to you all about kind of what I've learned over the course of my career and how we've interpreted that and used that at Aten. So as many of you know, we are a strategy, design, and development company. So we really see strategy as the foundation that creates great work for design and development and is really how we plan out what is necessary to design and build and really make sure that we have a great kind of understanding and foundation to jump off of. So looking forward to kind of getting a better sense of what that looks like. We're going to start by what we mean by strategy, when it makes sense to use different strategy tools or services, either in-house on your own or with a vendor like Aten, and just some case studies of how we've approached this internally. So starting with what we mean by strategy, just want to start that don't worry, you are not the only person who doesn't know what a strategist does. Very few people really have an understanding of what the role means. So just want to kind of lay the groundwork that this is something that is often very new to everybody talking to a strategist. But, I've had some pretty fun guesses that people have had in the past. One time, a stand-up comedian asked me what I did and followed up by asking if I do Napoleon-era war strategies. I one time explained to an uncle for a good half hour what I do, and at the end he said, "So do you do feng shui?" And I was like, "Yeah, we kind of direct people through an experience." A good friend of mine, every time somebody would ask what I did, would kind of jump in and say, wait, I want to try. I want to take a pass and see if I can explain what your role is. So it's really something that is um, it's defined in so many different ways, but it is something that is very unusual it's very typical to not really have a strong sense of what the word means. And part of that is because it means so many different things. Strategy in different industries has different meanings. So that might mean like what we work on in digital apps and websites, business strategy, marketing and social strategies, management and campaigns, politics, urban planning, design. All of these have very different interpretations of what strategy means. And even within the web industry, it's such a broad term. We're going to use a couple of these loose categories today, UX strategy and content strategy, to talk about some of these services and strategy meanings within the web industry. But there is a lot of overlap. So by no means are these exclusive, just meant to talk to some of the nuance of variation that you might see across the field in different vendors and different contexts. So that might refer to things like analytics analysis or user testing, workshops, surveys, technical content audits, and messaging guidelines, brand guidelines, SEO and findability, and if your content is findable, authoring workflows and how content is published to your CMS. But what do all these things have in common? Strategy as a whole really is just a means of providing a flexible set of tools for determining where you want to go and how you're going to get there. And specifically in website design, we're really referring to the process of researching and planning how a site will meet the needs of its users, content editors, and the organization that it represents. And sometimes that strategy tool is a process, like distributing a survey or running a workshop. And sometimes that tool is a deliverable, like persona, wireframes, or user journeys. These are really kind of ways of us packaging the findings that we gather in those processes. So how do we plan the right strategy work for your website? At Aten, we really focus on customizing a data and narrative-driven scope for each project, but really make sure to tailor fit our approach to understand an organization's needs in order to have the greatest user-centric impact with the resources available. So we're going to dive into when you should use different UX strategy tools and services and what is gained from each. So just to kind of go ahead and jump into that, just to go back to those kind of initial definitions or loose groups that we mentioned, that I mentioned just a moment ago. UX strategy is really just the general process of understanding how your organization and users are currently using a website and where there are opportunities to improve the experience and better support the work. So starting with analytics analysis, user analytics, and largely we're referring to Google Analytics 4 with this. They're used with existing sites. It is used when you want to understand how your users are currently engaging with your content. So you do receive concrete quantitative data around what pages users are visiting, where they and how they arrive on the site, whether that's through the device or through what kind of the route, if they're coming from Google or a direct search. And we're also, if you have a tool like Microsoft Clarity, which is a free heat mapping tool we often recommend, we're able to see where users are clicking on pages. So for example, as you see in that middle image, we're able to see what percentage of users are clicking on certain pages, certain items, and really get a sense for how users are not only navigating across pages and which pages are most visited, but how they're interacting with those. So it really depends on kind of the types of analytics and the depth of the data that's available, but that can be a pretty light lift for your vendor, as well as something that you can kind of engage with on a more light touch basis. User testing is our next kind of general category. This is used when you want to test if users can easily find content on a site. So the amount of investment or the insights that you gain really vary depending on if the test is moderated or not, if you have somebody there to talk to the user, or if they're receiving kind of a link that they're going ahead and testing on their own, and really if you're recruiting from your existing audience or using an online platform. So that would mean really kind of the range of, do you hear from people who are familiar with your site, but have a lot of investment and maybe some, for better or for worse, the familiarity? Or are you using a tool that hosts a wide range of users who go through these tests routinely and are easy to kind of reference if it is a challenge to get in touch with your existing audience? So what you can get from this is quantitative data that verifies or tests internal assumptions around how information should be grouped on the site, and the option to hear directly from your audiences to understand why they perceive topics in certain categories. So again, this can be this can range from being very light touch as it's distributed and unmoderated, or if it's something where we're really coordinating how we hear from specific audiences, how we get in touch with users, structuring the interview materials and conducting those conversations. That can be on a higher workload level for your vendor and for the client and for you as an organization to coordinate that outreach. But this is an opportunity to save budget as well, where specifically tree jack testing is something we would recommend. It's an unmoderated tool that you can distribute to your audiences through things like your newsletter or any other kind of direct means of outreach. Or as I mentioned, you can recruit through user panels with tools like Optimal Workshop that hosts that has users who are signed up and that you can recruit from and determine who you want to hear from. And this can be a way to test if users can find key information. So as you're kind of seeing in that bottom right, this really requires things like an Excel of kind of the hierarchy of where things will live within your menus, and really just testing kind of, can people find information in the right way? And what is the quantitative data that informs the percentage of users who can or cannot find key pieces of information? Surveys are our next tool that are a really strong and very flexible tool in the strategy toolkit. It's something that can be used whenever you want to hear feedback from your audiences and or staff about what they want from the website. So you can gain a balance, and it really depends on the type of survey, but it can range from quantitative to qualitative data, and it really gives you a sense of what users want and are currently unable to do on the site, and how different parts of your organization have outgrown the site. So this is all the things that you won't see in your analytics. This is understanding what people want from your site and who isn't, and what they want to be able to find and maybe can't, and you're not seeing in the data on your site currently. So this really gives us a tool to evolve a site and understand what maybe needs to be higher in terms of the page hierarchy, or more prevalent, more featured. And it really, for us, acts as a means of outreach for later interviews, workshops, and prototyping. We often recommend having the vendor do the survey, to be totally honest, partially because we like to be able to manipulate the data that's coming out of the survey. So whether that's filtering by audiences and understanding how distinct audiences would prioritize certain parts of your site, or understanding how users who are frequent visitors are navigating the site versus people who have very low familiarity with the site and don't visit very often. Often we find when we're handed a survey that's been done in-house that we find a lot of kind of demographic data that is not necessarily always relevant to the site that we're doing. For example, we are not going to make a different site depending on gender or location, um, but do want to be able to kind of filter the data and make sure that we can structure the survey to really fit kind of the expectations of whether we want to have quantifiable data that tells us the priority level, or if we want to hear qualitative input and suggestions from the users. So this really ranges in terms of how qualitative to quantitative the data is and the feedback is, but is generally a fairly light touch tool that can really provide a lot of value to a project. Interviews are something that we can use to hear from specific points of view, such as department leadership or program directors. This helps us to establish high-level priorities, and they often range from either one-on-ones or one-on-twos, or in groups, as we're seeing in that bottom right-hand corner. It really provides a format to gather input from key decision makers in your organization, as well as provide a more formal environment to raise awareness and really showcase the work that you're doing on your website. So again, this can be fairly low or high, depending on the number of people, the level of depth on the interviews, the number of interviews. It does require some lift on the client side in terms of coordinating and making sure that we have the right people in the room, are asking the right questions. And this is another opportunity to potentially save money. So this is where we can really look at hosting interviews in-house by your project team or website team and sharing those insights with the vendor. While we do appreciate being able to hear directly, I think that is something that is an opportunity for your team to take on and really make sure that those insights are really quickly and concisely translated to the vendor, and we're not investing our time in having those conversations. I would recommend sites like Nielsen Norman Group has a lot of great guidelines for conducting interviews and other kinds of strategy work. They are really a great resource if you're looking for any kind of guidelines on conducting strategy, on any kinds of UX engagements. They really have a lot of robust bite-sized trainings that I think is really, really helpful. Virtual workshops are something that we often use in strategy. They are used to collect input from a group of people with different perspectives. So we typically recommend people who are comfortable in a virtual collaboration environment, who are working at their desks and can engage in a Zoom-like conversation. It's when we're wanting to make sure that we're understanding how the website can better support their needs and existing pain points on the site. So again, we're kind of starting with our survey data, understanding what's important or what people can't find, and then really digging into why are things important to people? How would they expect to find things? Where are there opportunities to improve that experience? We're gaining qualitative input from different stakeholder groups, so establishing the opportunity to understand why users are or aren't engaging with different parts of the website, where there are opportunities to improve that connection, and really just making sure that we hear both the quantitative input from things like analytics and surveys, but also the qualitative input of what should your website do, what could your website do, what are some of the opportunities that excite people and really motivate them. So this really ranges in terms of the level of the amount of content that's being reviewed with workshop participants, as well as the range of engagement and whether or not there's a need for things like breakout groups within our virtual workshop. It does require some workload on the client's part, again, in terms of identifying who should be involved, coordinating their involvement, and making sure that we have the right people in the right room, right virtual room. On the really high end of our strategy engagements, we're looking at in-person workshops. So we often recommend this for place-based organizations such as cities or museums, and those that have the resources to host in-person workshops. This really takes a lot of the value that we have of virtual workshops to hear from different perspectives and really build that qualitative input, but also supports people with boundaries or barriers to virtual collaboration environments. So often if we're talking to users who are, if we really want to hear from elderly or bilingual users, it can be beneficial to not assume that they're comfortable in a Zoom-like environment and instead kind of meet them where they're at, make it easier to engage in conversation. It provides, again, the benefits of the virtual workshop, but with the ability to support more diverse users sometimes, foster conversation that's limited in Zoom environments, as I mentioned, and also exposes your vendors to the qualities that make the place unique. So as we understand kind of the design qualities and the general experience of a place, we can really make sure that we take that identity and bridge it into the web environment. So getting into content strategy, this is the side of our work that sometimes refers to information architecture, but is really how we understand how your organization wants to structure content on the site. So this really ranges depending on the types of clients that we're working with. Sometimes this is a very narrative approach. Sometimes it's more technical. Always for us, it's user-centric, but we want to make sure that we understand what are the structures that kind of guide how content will be authored and navigated across the site. So starting with a content audit, a technical content audit is often used to is only used with existing sites. It's a way to document and trim how the site is structured through content types, taxonomies, plugins, authoring permissions, and more. This is often used in combination with an analytics analysis to audit what pages are on the site and where there is room to archive or consolidate pages. So again, we're really looking for the most part at plugins and content types. This is really where we get a sense of what needs to migrate and what is really unimportant to include in our redesign, or just generally in any kind of work that you're doing with a vendor. So this really identifies where there's opportunities to consolidate content, to trim any kind of anything that just hasn't been used or hasn't been audited for a good period of time. It really ranges in terms of the workload, depending on the complexity of the content and kind of what's there. And this is something that, again, can be done in-house by a client. I think as we move into any kind of redesign where the pages, content types, plugins, user roles, and taxonomies have already been audited and reviewed, it helps us to both save time and provide more accurate estimates for redesigns as we understand really what is and isn't relevant to the new version of the site. We use messaging guidelines to help organizations communicate their work. And it really helps us to take a very narrative-driven approach and a brand-driven approach to how users will browse your organization story. So we deliver this as a guiding framework that organizes your story into high-level chapters, quote unquote, which is often displayed in landing pages. And it really determines how we both show and tell the messages through supporting content and media. So as we have the high-level idea that we want to get across to users, we can ensure that we understand what types of videos, content, related news, related pages, profiles, all of that, that helps us to understand how do we categorize information in a way that takes people through the narrative that we want to tell them. So this can be really range in terms of the level of information, the level of storytelling that we need to translate for an organization and how much has been determined already. And for clients is often a review process and is less time intensive. We often hear clients looking for SEO strategy. This is really when we want to make sure that users can find content on your site, and especially SEO is relevant if you have competitors that you want to rank higher in Google. So we typically recommend for us incorporating an SEO plugin on your site from a development point of view, but also from a strategic point of view, talking to users and really understanding how your audience would organize and phrase and label your content to ensure that as they search for certain topics, that it aligns with their expectations and the way they're searching matches the labeling of the content itself. So, however, if you're looking for more advanced tracking in terms of how your content ranks compared to competitors, we recommend hiring an SEO agency. Again, we often work with organizations that like to do more of a comparative analysis than a competitive analysis, noting that, for example, we are working with a large airport at the moment, and for the most part, people know to find an airport. We really want to make sure they can find content in the site, but it's less critical that they are the airport that shows up when they're the main municipal airport. So if you're working with an SEO agency, you do have that hard data that tracks how you rank for keywords and keyword queries on Google. And for us, we really incorporate the results directly into the final website. A sitemap is essentially on every website. I hope most people know what that means, but it really is just generally a tool to structure how pages are organized on the site, how users navigate to those pages through menus, and what content lives on those pages. So for us, we include clear documentation of not only what the menu navigation items are, but how pages are categorized, both under those menus or in nested hierarchies of content, how that incorporates and kind of relates to the content types that are denoted and used to structure content. And for any key landing pages, going in and making sure we understand the sections of content that are included on key landing pages. So this really depends, the workload for this depends on the levels of hierarchy, the level of complexity of the site. If and just to clarify, I think for that, that's really how do users navigate. So for some websites that we work with, there might be thousands of pages, but 999 of those are going to be news articles. So we want to make sure that if we're looking at multiple levels of hierarchy and menus that people look through, that's clear and that we have scope for that. But if we're really looking at one page where all news articles are living, that's a different type of scope for us as a vendor. We also are looking often in conjunction with a sitemap, what we call a content map. So this should be used for sites that have expansive amounts of content that have not been audited for a considerable amount of time. So we're often using this with sitemaps and with migration planning to connect how existing content will either be referenced if we want to rebuild some pages, or how we'll be directly migrating into new structures. This is delivered as documentation that denotes how existing pages, how existing content types, fields, and taxonomies are categorized under the new site, and any supplementary information, such as which department owns a page or any kinds of plugins that are incorporated into that content as well. So this is a very time-intensive process we're often combing through hundreds to thousands of pages of content, occasionally to really understand how that applies to kind of our new site as we've understood this kind of user-centric sitemap and menu approach. And we're often also requiring close collaboration with the departments and content owners to determine what needs to be directly migrated, what is recreated, and what is archived. So for example, we might have individual pages that house a single PDF, and we want to make sure that those are incorporated with other content onto a single landing page, and that we're using that to reference what kind of content is moving in. But often, especially if we're migrating things like those news articles, events, things like that, we really want to, if it's incredibly helpful for us to work with a client or really kind of share that workload to identify what needs to be on the new site and what can be archived. So especially if we look at kind of the content audit, anytime that we can identify pages, content types, user roles, taxonomies that are not relevant to your site currently or in the future, that's really helpful for us to save that time and kind of share that workload with the client. So getting into more of kind of our qualitative different types of strategy tools and how we break down pages within that sitemap. We use wireframes to structure how key landing pages and page types will be structured on the new site, either through a narrative breakdown of a landing page or the sections, fields, and components on a page or content type, and making sure we understand what is necessary to include in that template. This provides visual gray box outlines of the pages, components, and fields that will then be designed and developed in subsequent phases. So again, this really depends on the number of content types, the number of landing pages and listing pages that will need to be interacted with by users and really determined by your brand narrative, but is more of a kind of review process for the client and less time intensive. Our final content strategy service that we're going to be looking at is what we call a content model. So this is used to inform and then document how a design breaks down into content types and fields, the flexible components, the interactions between content, plugins that are incorporated in user permissions, and more. It really provides the documentation for a development team to take a static design and build it into the intended authoring experience include the dynamic dependencies that are included in a static design, and understand what the user experience should be from both a end user and from a content author. So this is something that, depending on the level of complexity of the relationships between the content, can be a relatively high workload for a vendor or a relatively low. So just to give a sense of what this actually looks like and how we really kind of determine how to customize this approach, it's really not only important to leverage both the right tools that we just went through, but to ensure that each tool is aligned with your capacity and expectations. So for example, if you're planning to distribute a survey to 20 department heads, we might look at something more qualitative and questions and open-ended responses. But if we want to send something to thousands of newsletter recipients, we might be thinking about questions that are more easy to quantify and export rather than going through lots of open-ended responses, or ensuring that it's really easy to navigate in a mobile environment versus staff that are sitting at their desk. If users are primarily navigating your site through landing pages, and it's fairly simple in terms of the levels of hierarchy or the number of items within your menus, or if we have not only kind of site-wide menus, as well as specific hierarchical menus within some parts of the site, such as getting into, for example, the airport operations and understanding that under police that there's multiple pages or multiple items that you can navigate from there. That's where we start to get a much more expansive scope for doing a sitemap. But in general, setting the right expectations with your vendor can really ensure that the right stakeholders and users are involved, and that you're prioritizing resources to set up next steps for success and not investing where you don't need the work. So we have developed an in-house strategy scoping tool that we use for our own process. It's a tool that we use to understand an organization's needs through a simple set of questions, such as whose input is important to integrate, how do you want to hear from different stakeholders, where there are opportunities to save budget, and what are the baseline needs that we know we need to plan for to make a successful project. It's something that I built using ChatGPT, Google Sheets, and AppScript. As somebody who's very much non-technical, it's been an interesting approach to learn to use ChatGPT for the first time. Highly recommend it if you're interested in kind of exploring the tool. I essentially just kind of was asking it, hey, if I check this checkbox, I want to reveal these questions, or I want to reveal this scope. So it was really helpful to, I'm not a developer, but I am learning to write code in Google Sheets. So would recommend using that as a starting place to dabble in the AI space. So yeah, it's an interactive tool that we use in-house to determine line items, to determine dependencies that we need to be aware of, and gives us the baseline for a rough scope of work for a client. So just to give a sense of a couple case studies of work we're doing that kind of represents how we customize and really understand kind of what the strategy needs are for a client. Starting on the lower end, let's kind of walk through, for example, a usability study. So this is somebody who doesn't have the budget for a full redesign, but knows users can't find information on the site. So this is where we're looking to figure out where the issues are and identify kind of targeted solutions to solve those. So we're going to look at some work we've been doing recently for the Richland Library, which is a website that Aten designed and built 7 years ago. And we've been doing kind of interim tests to really ensure that users can find information. So starting with analytics, we're looking at things like Microsoft Clarity to understand how people are using the site in terms of the devices, using the heat mapping tool, how far they're scrolling into pages and which aspects they're clicking on. Combining that with Google Analytics to identify how many people are visiting different pages within their services menu. Starting with that, we're kind of getting into doing surveys, so hearing from both the staff and from users, launching a survey on their site to identify what their needs are and to hear suggestions. Excuse me. So this was giving us both a quantifiable input in terms of what's important to different users, but also identifying where there are some gaps in between what internal staff feel is important to users and what is really what we're hearing from users. So for example, we heard that digital resources are much more of a priority to users compared to how the staff think that they're important. And book recommendations are something that are more frequently requested than the staff would expect. So making sure that we can kind of compare those data sets and hear from both groups. We take that quantifiable input and begin doing kind of our virtual workshopping with the staff and with our project team. So both kind of identifying what are the specific audiences and ensuring that we understand kind of the nuances within why different types of groups come to the site, and doing an audience categorization session, doing our user needs and user journey virtual workshop sessions to identify how high of a priority different types of pages on the site are to different audiences. So hearing from different department staff what is important, and really making sure that as we go and review the menus that we understand kind of what content is the highest priority to the broadest range of audiences, and understanding where there's opportunities to improve the experience of highlighting information, directing users to different types of resources or pages that exist, and generally making sure that we understand kind of key pain points, questions that come up, and hearing from the staff around what that looks like. So with that, we're looking at kind of suggesting key adjustments to the menus, some labeling, adding different items, looking at how we use the components within their services page and where there's opportunities to improve or adjust their design system to accommodate some of the gaps that users aren't able to find. And we're just right now wrapping up kind of how we package that. So looking at both talking to users and running a series of usability tests to hear and verify those decisions, make sure that things are still that are easy to find, understanding where there's any gaps in terms of how they would expect to find information and how they would label some of the items that we know are difficult to find, creating an aggregated scoring that helps us to understand both if people are successful in using the menus as we're proposing, as well as packaging that into a final recommendations report. So this does give us kind of a sense of, we end with specific recommendations to adjust on the site, often through tools like wireframes. And it really kind of includes, of the services and tools we looked at, surveys, analytics, work sessions. In general, this does kind of range in the 100 to under 150 kind of hour range, depending on the client's resources. Our next case study that we're going to look at that kind of represents a number of projects and organizations we work with. This is an organization that's creating a flagship website to showcase the work that's being done for a new initiative. So for this, we might start with, we're going to look at a kind of example of a institute website that we're doing for our partners at the Sanford Underground Research Facility. For this group, we were working with a very core project team that was really able to help us identify kind of what the needs were and speak on behalf of audiences, so in behalf of the broader organization. So we were working with that team to refine the audiences, to kind of take some of the reports that had been done previously and translate that both into a core mission for the site and core purpose to help them understand kind of the vision for what the future of the site will be, as well as going into messaging pillars and really making sure that we understand what are the key messages and key narrative points that we want users to have across the site. So we're taking that and translating that into a clear narrative, really breaking down what the core purpose of the site is, what key messages are. And then as we get into, let's maybe zoom in a little bit. Okay, so as we get into our wireframing, we're taking those different types of messaging pillars and making sure that we understand both how the landing page overall will, what's important to communicate through that, what's the overall purpose, but also what is the purpose of each section as it supports that high-level message. What are the types of content, visuals, related pages that we want to make sure are featured, and really making sure that we understand kind of what is the overall message that we want to get across and how are we guiding people through the narrative of the work that's being done. So this is something that you can see as on the case study on our site, is a really exciting website that is very narrative driven. We're really helping an organization to understand how to structure their messaging, as well as incorporating that into the final design and design system, and providing the flexible tools as we're seeing in these kind of icon lists here, as well as some of the core calls to action that we want people to take across the site. So for this kind of flagship site, we're looking at probably about 80 to 100 hours on average to really kind of take us from scratch to a flagship, pretty concise site, working largely with a project team to go through different types of workshops and work sessions, focusing our wireframing and sitemap work on really focusing on a narrative. And we occasionally, depending on the needs and resources, will deliver a final report to kind of present up to any kind of leadership what the new site will be, how the message is being communicated, and the option to also hear from those individuals in roundtables or one-on-one interviews. What I would consider kind of a standard site is anybody that is due for a redesign and wants to make sure the new website is a good fit for users, staff, programs, and brand strategy. So just to kind of look at some of the work we're doing with the Smithsonian right now, excuse me, hearing from the Lemelson, we're working with this group called the Lemelson Center, which is really a center for the study of invention and innovation within the National Museum of American History. So for them, we're running surveys with stakeholders, users, interviewing some of their staff members and department heads, taking that feedback and working with a project team that represents kind of the breadth of the organization to, again, refine those users, the audiences, and the reasons people come to the site. What is the highest priority across those audiences on the site? And kind of bridging that into how do we translate the work into key messages, and how do kind of users navigate through landing pages to find content across the site. So for this, we're looking at, again, kind of translating that into a report that documents the overall project goal for the Lemelson Center, really inspiring inventive identity and helping diverse users and audiences see themselves in the process of invention, highlighting what those users look like and how they kind of engage, what their priorities and questions are. And then what are some of those key messages that we want to get across to those users? What are topics, content types, and supporting sections of that page that we want to make sure is clear as users kind of navigate through the site? So we take those messaging pillars and kind of user needs and translate that first into a high-level menu navigation that tells us how users will navigate the site. And then from there, getting a sense for a full site map that looks at existing content, content types, sections of a page for anything that is not wireframed, and any kind of nested content within a site. So for example, if we're looking at a calendar, making sure that we identify where the events for that calendar live. And again, for this, we're looking at translating all of that into our wireframes, where we denote the narrative breakdown of a page, making sure that as we get a sense for the high-level objectives, such as inspiring inventive identity, that we both understand kind of how that fits into the structure, but then how do we guide people through the different parts of the work that's being done, and what is kind of the narrative-driven approach that we're using to guide users through content across the site. So for this, just to kind of give a preview of the site as it's in development, this is something that we then see kind of translate directly into our final design, where we understand both the narrative approach as well as what kinds of parts, pieces, fields, images will be used to support that overall narrative, and how we want to direct users to different needs that are high priority. So for this, we're often translating that into a fairly standard content model. So the components, the flexible components, the content types and the templated fields for them, the dynamic content lists and views that are visible across the site if we're using Drupal or WordPress. And again, this is looking at around 150 to 180 hours. Typically kind of includes kind of what we consider the baseline of a redesign for strategy of gathering data through analytics and surveys, workshopping that data with our stakeholders and stakeholders and staff, and then translating that into wireframe, sitemap, and a content model and final discovery report. And then just to kind of give a sense for the high end of where we really see strategy expanding and playing a different role. This is for our large civic clients, we often hear the need for a partner who can handle input from a large group of internal stakeholders and use data to drive decisions that helps to evolve and migrate a complex site. So looking at work that we're doing for the city of Oxnard, again, project that is going to be live soon and is currently wrapping up development. We are looking at taking a very data-driven approach, looking at things like census demographics, analytics, and getting a sense for how users navigate the site, gathering input from a survey of the staff to really hear what are the different nuances and what are the different audiences that they work with that might not be completely obvious to a project team alone. From there, we're looking at workshopping with both the staff and with the audiences. So doing virtual workshops with our staff for this project. Again, looking at just the range of needs and hearing from different departments how the audiences they work with would prioritize different types of information. And then meeting with different representatives for user groups in person. So hearing from librarians to citizens to bilingual audiences, business owners, a really wide range of users that could tell us how they would expect to find that content on the site in terms of navigating the complexity of such a broad website and broad amount of content, and just ensuring that we understand how they would expect to find those things. And as we go into building the site, that they are able to use the tools that are being built and navigate to them. So we use this as a very kind of data-driven approach, as I mentioned earlier, really making sure that we understand both from a content and what is being used now and what is being accessed, and how do we bridge that into our the workshops and surveys and what we hear from individuals in those, and making sure that we have a very concrete set of data and information that lets us make decisions around what information should be in kind of prioritized in the hierarchy of menus, giving us the ability to push back against any kind of bias by a certain department if they want to highlight information, and really having the data to kind of make those decisions around. And from there, we use that as we kind of get into the menus. So understanding both from with the color key denoting kind of the different departments that own the items on the menus, that we understand how users would navigate to different content on the site, how it's managed, and how do we migrate kind of existing content into this new user-centric lens. So again, this is something that we're really excited about how it's translated into the final design, and looking at different ways of navigating that. So again, this is a really high on our end. It's something that is around the 200 to 220 hour benchmark as a baseline, and is really where we start to see kind of the high end of how strategy can really support organizations. So as you've noted, this is really just a wide, part of the reason that strategy is so vague is because it is so many different things to so many different people across industries. And we just want to really make sure that we leave you all with kind of the intention that it's an art, not a science. Every website and organization is unique, and we're really here to kind of support and make sure that we can help users and different organizations support their websites as a strategic partner, and how strategy can really custom fit those needs.